So I've never watched the movie Good Will Hunting until like 3 weeks ago. I know, I should feel ashamed. Apparently it's won some awards or something. So today I'm going to look at the movie Good Will Hunting and look at the different pedagogies within it, the pedagogies that are functioning within it, and also deconstruct the movie in a bit of a feminist analysis kind of way. Just as a refresher, what is pedagogy again? Okay, dictionary.com states that pedagogy is the function or work of a teacher, the art or science of teaching, education, instructional methods, the method and practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical concept. So in essence, how we teach and how we learn. So what does this movie teach us about pedagogy? Firstly, I think we can look at the idea of a personal self-disclosure as pedagogy. The idea of sharing personal anecdotes with a person in order to build somewhat of a repertoire with them in order to encourage learning. The idea behind sharing personal information about oneself allows for individuals to share the common experience of humanity with one another. And what this shared experience of humanity kind of does between the teacher and the student is it kind of breaks down the power relations between the two individuals. The position of a teacher often has more authority than that of a student, so to share common experiences of humanity brings them to somewhat of a similar level. Secondly, I think this movie also teaches us that pedagogy does not need to be linear, for example, from teacher to student, but rather it can be reciprocal or in a way cyclical, so between multiple people and being exchanged between people in a give and take sort of way. For example, here are my notes that I took during the movie. I don't know if you can see it, but I did a little bit of a diagram here as I was watching the movie. I think the typical way that the viewer is supposed to be viewing this movie is that Robin Williams' character Sean is supposed to be teaching Matt Damon's character Will something. That passing on of knowledge is supposed to go from between like the teacher to the student. But that being said, it can also be seen that Will is in fact teaching Sean some things as well. I want to share this quote of a scene between Sean and Will. Sean is kind of reprimanding Will for the way in which he lives his lifestyle, and so we see this idea that Sean is kind of supposed to be teaching Will something in some sort of way, but really what's happening is Will is teaching Sean something, or really attempting to. It starts with Sean, and he's addressing Will. Maybe you're perfect right now. Maybe you don't want to ruin that. I think that's a super philosophy, Will. That way you can go through your entire life without ever having to really know anybody. You ever think about getting remarried? My wife's dead. Hence the word remarried. She's dead. Yeah, well, I think that's a super philosophy, Sean. I mean, that way you could actually go through the rest of your life without ever really knowing anybody. So I think that's really interesting in a sense that Will is kind of like using what Sean is trying to teach him to kind of like teach him something at the same time, because he makes a bit of a good point. I think this scene is a really good example of how the movie kind of challenges who should be learning from who. I want to put emphasis on the word should. Who should be learning from who we're expecting to learn from who, and it really kind of messes with that power dynamic that's there. Thirdly, there's also the idea of how to teach and how to approach teaching. Sean and Professor Lambeau are seen in one of the most kind of hardcore scenes in the movie as getting into this really big argument about what is best for Will. Sean is really particular about not pushing Will too far. This kid has already been pushed far enough in his life. He's undergone child abuse and abuse through foster homes, etc., etc. So it's really the idea of like slow and steady wins the race, whereas Professor Lambeau is really kind of like adamant about doing things a certain way, and where Sean is like, yeah, no, that is not going to teach him anything. I think also in this idea of conflict between Sean and Professor Lambeau also comes a bit of a classist debate as well. Professor Lambeau is a professor, has a PhD education at a really well-renowned institution, and Sean is just a community college teacher. The movie brought up a lot of ideas of who is worthy enough to pass on knowledge. It also really complicates the idea of, again, who should be teaching people and who should be passing on knowledge. It's this assumption that people with PhDs and teaching at prestigious institutions are the ones who have the authority and have the reputability to actually be teaching other individuals, whereas what's a community college teacher going to teach? They're obviously not going to be able to teach as much to an individual that a professor is. And then that, in some way, is deemed a failure. Also, just another little tidbit of the who should be teaching who debate also comes not only between a professor and community college teacher, but also through the idea of student versus minimum wage job holder. There's a scene at the beginning of the movie, the very, very beginning of the movie, where Will and his buddies go into a bar, and he kind of reprimands this guy who is obviously a student at the university and is quoting some really big sociological figures. And Will kind of says, like, what, do you think that you're smarter than me because you dish out like thousands and thousands of dollars a year to pay for the same books that I could get at the public library down the street? Give your head a shake. I think that's really interesting too, because that comes back to the idea of who supposedly holds knowledge and who holds the most knowledge, and the assumptions within that. Overall, I found this movie was pretty good. It was fairly typical. I do have one critique of it though. There's an article by a man named William Ayers that talks about this idea of teachers within film and this sort of teacher-savior complex. To quote Ayers and what he says about the teacher-savior complex, he says, "The teacher-savior is marked not necessarily by his overwhelming success, but rather by his refusal to give up on students. Therefore, because he does not give up, he wins their grudging respect." Also, the teacher is often male, and he is often an outsider. If he's white, perhaps he's a loner coming from some failure in the past. Does that sound familiar? I definitely think that Robin Williams' character Sean is definitely a teacher savior. Not only is he white, but he is sort of somewhat of an outsider. He lives on his own because of his wife's death. So he does not prescribe to that, wife and kids, typical American dream ideal. In essence, we are also kind of thought to believe through Professor Lambeau that Sean is somewhat of a failure because he didn't go off and become a university professor like his college roommate. That being said, I have some questions. Why was Robin Williams cast for this role instead of, say, a woman? Why was it necessary to have the teacher role be fulfilled by a man? What if instead of casting Robin Williams, they casted Sigourney Weaver? How would that have made the movie different? Would it still have had the same effect? Not looking at acting or anything like that, or acting quality, yada yada, even though that is important, but more so, how would that have changed the actual story of the movie? Would it have changed at all? Secondly, what if instead of having the teacher counselor role fulfilled by someone who's white, what if the teacher role was from someone who was African American or Aboriginal or Mexican, not of white privilege? How would that have changed the movie? How would that have changed the dynamics? Do you think it would have changed at all? So, in a nutshell, those are my thoughts about Good Will Hunting. If you have any comments or questions, leave them down below and I'll try and answer them to the best of my ability. We'll see you guys next time.